afternoon to all our attendees and panelists. My name is Nathalie Moll, and I'm the Director General of EFPIA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our very first online COVID seminar. This is the first of a series, of which the next one is already the day after tomorrow, and as with everything to do with COVID, time is of the essence, so we will be diving into more detail of the things that we are going to touch upon today in the next few seminars as well. Just before I start, some housekeeping rules. Please keep your cameras and mics off. If you have any questions, please draft this in the chat and add your name and place of work so that we can identify you. We will not be answering in the chat, but I will be receiving and fielding your questions. There may be many questions and we may not be able to answer all of them during the chat, but we can also answer by email afterwards. So with these very few words of introduction of how the session will run, we have 1 hour, 3 fantastic speakers, and we're going to try and keep it as interactive as possible for everybody. I know that we're all very interested to talk about this topic and have some fantastic experts here to guide us through that. And I'd like to start just by saying that for those of you who don't know EFPIA, we represent the innovative pharmaceutical industry with many large as well as small companies. And at the end of March, we published our commitment to tackling the coronavirus pandemic, focused in 3 areas that we will be discussing this afternoon: ensuring a safe supply of medicines to the patients who need them, researching and developing new vaccines, treatments, as well as diagnostics for the use in the fight against COVID-19, as well as partnering and supporting healthcare systems on the ground in the fight as of the very beginning. There are 12 commitments. I'm not going to go into them in detail. If you want, you can find them on our website. But now, to take us into a little bit more detail, I'd like to start from the very beginning at the level of research for diagnostic treatments and vaccines. I'm delighted to welcome Paul Stoffels, who's the Vice Chairman of the Executive Committee of Johnson & Johnson, as well as being the Chief Scientific Officer. And in his role, he works with R&D leaders across Johnson & Johnson to set the enterprise-wide research and innovation agenda, and has oversight of all product safety at Johnson & Johnson. As the eyes of the world are really focused on the search for a vaccine, for treatments and diagnostics, Paul is at the cutting edge of that. And I'd like to hand over the word to you, Paul. Thank you.
Nathalie, thank you very much. And it's happy to meet you all on the webinar here. Let me first give a total overview, I think, on our industry, vaccines, diagnostic drugs, is working on all the aspects of COVID-19. As you know, there is a lot of attention for the diagnostics, especially first of all with the PCR. How can we as quickly as possible diagnose people whether they are infected, yes or no? Also the antigen testing and antibody testing for afterwards, who is positive and has been infected, yes or no? So there's a lot of attention for that, and I know very many companies are working on that to go to very fast testing, but also optimized point of care testing, so that people can get this done at home or in their pharmacy or with the nurse or the doctor in the neighborhood. So that's an important evolution. Many companies are working on that. When you go to the drugs for COVID-19, industry has taken a pragmatic approach on trying to find what medicines could help in this very short term. And for that, you have to go to existing medicines or medicines already in clinical development. That time to result is very short. So there are several initiatives in the world who are screening at the moment all existing medicines on whether they have antiviral effect on COVID-19 and very quickly testing them in controlled clinical trials. That has been a little chaotic in the beginning because people thought they had to test everything. Now it's much more getting organized to make sure that there are platform studies where they can be compared to each other and evaluated. So as we go to the screening, there will be many hits coming out of the antiviral screening, and they need to be carefully identified and then evaluated whether they should go into clinical testing, yes or no. Normally, such a screening works from testing to preclinical to humans several years, or at least a year or two. Now it's going all in weeks, and of course we have to make all our best scientific evidence available to make sure not too many unnecessary drugs are pushed through the system. So, and that's work which is ongoing. IMI is involved in that, BARDA in the US, but also the Gates Foundation. Everyone is working hard to help getting that managed. And then there is the other part of anti-inflammatory medicines, which seem to be very important for hospitalized, very sick people, and they are all being evaluated. Several are being evaluated as we speak. So pharma is plowing forward very quickly to evaluate whatever we can do to help patients and society quickly. But it's now believed that a vaccine is going to be essential for limiting the disease in the world, and especially preventing second, third, and fourth waves in the next few years or next few months. Vaccine development is always more cumbersome and longer because you have to vaccinate large number of people. Therefore, safety is very important and volume is very important. Let me talk a little bit about what we have been doing. We have been working on viral vaccines since a long time, and we started with, we have 4 in parallel ongoing for HIV, RSV, for Zika, and for Ebola. And so for those viruses, we developed a vector-based platform, which has the possibility to go to huge manufacturing possibilities. And then I talk about hundreds of millions. So learning from Ebola, Zika, in Zika, we went in 1 year from the virus to clinical trials. In Ebola, we could do it in 6 months because we had already a vaccine in the lab. And so we were able to do it between August and December to get into the clinic. Now we are even further accelerated from a virus getting into the clinic starting 15th of January to be available to start in the clinic early September and hopefully have significant data by the end of the year. What's very different here is that you need an enormous quantity. And so we have a cell line which can produce up to 300 million vaccines per 2,000 liters per year. And so we have a plant who can do that. At the moment, we are looking at putting 4 new plants on, which could give within the next 12 to 18 months annual vaccine production rate of 1 billion vaccines. And so combining an accelerated development of a vaccine with a lot of experience with the platform, combined with existing technology to manufacture it, we are working on moving that forward. It's amazing on how the regulators work with us. We have been able already to cut 3 months out of our program by having a very deep interaction with the regulators from day one. We started the vaccine development in 15th of January. 6 weeks later, we had 2 interactions with the FDA, 2 interactions with the European agencies, and we were able to cut 3 months out of the development program from the beginning because they learned and they helped us very quickly to see how to go faster and better. As we have already a lot of safety data from the other applications, we could go faster. So you can see in a very few minutes, and later on I am open for questions. There is a possibility to go fast. The world is working to go fast, mobilizing resources as well as all the capabilities from regulators, financiers, governments to get there. We are not the only one. There should be at least 4 to 5 vaccines going because, of course, ours could not work. It's possible that they fail. And so the industry has to come up with several paths to a vaccine in order to get next year, by the end of the year or next year, vaccines available for putting a stop to the epidemic. Nathalie, with that, I'll leave it for my introductory comments and give it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. That was very interesting and very fast as well. And you gave us a great segue to the regulatory flexibility that is indeed required and is already occurring. And today, when we face a pandemic, nothing is the same as before. We need flexibility and speed in everything. And to discuss that with us today, we have Alan Morrison, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at MSD. In his role, Alan leads the MSD International Regulatory Organization across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And he also covers Asia, China, and Japan. Perhaps, Alan, you can take us a little bit through what the navigation of the regulatory processes during the COVID-19 crisis has shown us.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nathalie. And I will try to stick religiously to my 5 minutes as well. So I think, you know, as we look to navigate the regulatory process during this COVID-19 crisis, I'd like to reflect on a couple of areas. One is really where we are today, and then maybe look how today's events might drive some of the developments for the future. And I think Paul already touched on a couple of these areas. So I think we use the term unprecedented on a daily basis here with this pandemic, and understandably so, as this pandemic is really stress testing our healthcare systems, including our global regulatory agencies, to a degree that we've never seen in the past. And this is certainly testing their resilience and making their needing the ability to adapt to very, very dynamic trends. So the kind of pace of change requires even better communication and coordination across regulatory agencies, particularly in a network like Europe, and also with other stakeholders. And I know this has been a key area of focus for EFPIA. So looking really to the short term, I think there's a few things that we need to focus on. SARS-CoV-2 clearly needs an innovative and flexible regulatory response, and Paul already touched on a couple of those topics, not only to facilitate these new diagnostics, treatments and vaccines, but also to maintain the development and supply of other new products that are currently ongoing. And I think that's something that we also need to keep in mind. COVID-19 is burdening healthcare systems in a way that has knock-on effects to clinical research and safety reviews and the ability for non-COVID-19 patients to get their medicines. And then even on a kind of pragmatic level, the lockdown requirements and social distancing require us to be able to work differently in our ability just to develop and have people in laboratories and manufacturing plants. And I'm sure that's something Simon will cover in his presentation. So around the world, regulators are accelerating some of these ongoing process innovations to help address this challenge. For example, there's an ongoing use of and a growing use of digital technologies to facilitate regulatory filings and certifications. So for example, EMA have now made their certification process electronic for CPPs, etc. Remote monitoring for clinical research and the increased use of telepresence meetings. There's also a greater emphasis on work sharing and reliance. And in some cases, regulators have been able to defer or reorganize current requirements to address the present working conditions. But I should emphasize, while retaining the regulatory principles that underpin our framework of quality, safety, and efficacy. So some examples of this would be the deferring of routine inspections, relying on desk-based reviews. For example, in Europe, the regulatory authorities, the Commission, the HMA, and the EMA have provided specific guidance on regulatory flexibilities and facilitation with exceptional change management process for treatments to address the COVID-19 patients. And in fact, that guidance was updated this morning to have further advice on GMP certification, the role of the qualified person, and some additional details on pharmacovigilance. And then finally, EFPIA and its members are providing real-time information and proposals to regulatory and health authorities on a day-to-day basis to ensure product supply. So moving forward then, we really shouldn't see the pandemic as a pause in our regulatory process, but more as a driver for change. Since 2018, EFPIA have, through the Regulatory Strategy Committee, developed a process we're describing as the regulatory road to innovation. EMA and the heads of medicines agencies are also engaged in mapping the European regulatory science strategy. And in collaboration, I think this work has led us in EFPIA in a regulatory road to innovation strategy to develop 4 priorities, which will have clear relevance to COVID-19 during this period. So I'll briefly touch upon them before concluding. Those would be encouraging the use of new and innovative types of clinical trials to help new medicines get to patients faster. So innovative approaches to evaluate new medicinal products, such as using master protocols, adaptive studies, and decentralized trial designs. Novel approaches for data collection that are suited to the challenge of evaluating products in the setting of a public health emergency. Secondly, allowing greater use of data from real-world use of treatment. As the current outbreak clearly shows, data collected in medical practice would not only inform healthcare systems, but indeed could also help inform the development of medicines. To address these current needs around real-world evidence or real-world data, European regulators can develop and adopt guidance on a real-world data framework with clear principles for data quality, interoperability, access, and regulatory acceptance. Thirdly, and an important facet, is allowing the ongoing dialogue and discussion about a medicine throughout its development process, i.e. dynamic regulatory assessment, to ensure novel treatments and vaccines for COVID-19 are developed as quickly and efficiently as possible. This ongoing dialogue could take place between developers and regulators. Again, Paul touched upon it. Other stakeholders from inception of scientific advice through the analysis and review of ongoing data. And then finally, there needs to be greater clarification and better integration of how medicines and other healthcare products are regulated. Approximately 25% of medicines approved in the EU contain a device component, and diagnostic tools and medicines are often evaluated by separate. They're evaluated by separate authorities, and diagnostics obviously play a key role in identifying those patients who are impacted by COVID-19. So we need to streamline and integrate the pathway for the assessment of drug-device combinations would be the fourth pillar in this approach. So thank you. I'll conclude there and look forward to taking some questions.
Thank you very much, Alan. And before I forget, I made a mistake. You're supposed to send your questions, understandably, to the Q&A button on the screen. So apologies to those who sent it to the chat. If you wouldn't mind copy-pasting them to the Q&A, we'd be really grateful. Thank you for that. And thank you. Now we've talked about the research. We've talked about regulation of the new products. But what about the supply of the existing products? As you know, our companies have been working around the clock to ensure the supply of medicines, not only to treat COVID-19, the ones that we have at the moment that Paul mentioned at the beginning, but also all the other products that are being held up because of the various measures that have been taken due to the pandemic. And with us this afternoon, we have Simon White, Director Supply Chain Quality Support for Pfizer. In his role, Simon provides strategic support for quality and good distribution practices aspects of Pfizer's global supply chain. Can I hand the word over to you, Simon? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nathalie. Hope you can hear me well.
Very well.
Good. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. So I'd like to sort of follow up on some of the points that Alan mentioned there on, testing our resilience. This pandemic is certainly testing the pharmaceutical supply chain's resilience, and in normal routine, let's say, the highly complex supply chains that we have developed over the decades are being put to the test, and the increased demand that we see at market level feeds back through a highly tuned process, a highly orchestrated process to send a signal back to the manufacturing sites across the network, global network, to send that signal to increase production, and largely that's what has been done when the pandemic kicked off. I would say that the categories of products involved initially were across the board. So we saw quite volatile demands, variable, and not only for treatments related to COVID-19, but across the pharmaceutical therapy range, for many different reasons, and we'll come on to those. So I think initially the trigger for increased production kicked in. I think it quite rapidly became apparent that we were under considerable pressure across the supply network, and we started to see, I guess, for sort of geopolitical, logistical reasons, issues arising as confinement kicked in around mid-March in the various countries around the world, and so that it triggered, and industry welcomed the initiative from the European Medicines Agency and the European Commission to set up a dialogue with industry directly. So I think we're in our 6th or 7th week now of weekly calls where industry can raise issues that we see on the ground, you know, practically speaking, in terms of the operations of distribution of medicines. We can raise those through our associations, so through EFPIA, but also the associations dealing with generics medicines, with medical devices, all the other components that need to come together to fight this pandemic. Not forgetting the treatments for all other diseases, which of course need to have their focus and normal supply in place. So this dialogue, where single points of contact were nominated from industry, gave us the opportunity to raise these issues. And while we might deal with them at country level through our affiliates with the local authorities, we also had the opportunity to raise issues through the Commission, so that the Commission was aware of, for example, individual member states' activities which were potentially causing problems for movement of goods and of people. And just to come back to one of the comments that Neil also made, was the movement of people with restrictions at borders meant that, you know, we had to ensure that operators for manufacturing sites, pharmaceutical manufacturing sites, were able to get to their place of work and treated as, you know, an essential business, especially in those, you know, relatively rare cases where we would have employees living in one member state working at a manufacturing site in another member state, and we had a few examples of those. The other aspect around movement of goods, which we welcomed, was the setting up of the green lanes, the green corridors, to make sure that, for example, food, but also medicines could be expedited when it came to border crossings. Of course, there we had to ensure, for example, that finished product is not the only sort of component that needs to be treated in that way. We also need to ensure, because of that accelerated production at the manufacturing sites, you know, they were rapidly depleting their reserve stocks of starting materials, reagents, solvents, all the other excipients and so on that go into the manufacture of finished products. So those components also have to be classified as pharmaceutical products to be expedited through the green corridors. Then we saw, and this dialogue gave the opportunity to raise you know, issues around air freight, and sea freight followed on, with the general slowing down of industry, and particularly of passenger transport, which often, you know, we would share in terms of air freight for pharmaceuticals. That was becoming a constricted element in the supply chain, requiring action at a pan-European level to keep goods, medicines in particular, moving. So that was a welcome initiative. It rapidly also became apparent that the particular categories of treatment required, along with protective equipment and along with ventilators, you know, if all the components are not there at the right time in the intensive care unit, the relevant treatment couldn't be applied. So we quickly came to the point of setting up a collaboration beyond the innovative pharmaceutical, research-based pharmaceutical companies, but also with the generics companies, the other associations, to look or to bring in transparency on how our stocks were holding up. So the realization, I guess, was that, you know, we're not in competition here, we're all in this together. It would help to know what other companies' stocks are like, so that at a pan-European level, we can look closer at allocation between countries. And that's, you know, another a spanner in the works almost of the process was identified when individual member states would bring in export restrictions or requisitioning even of medicines. So the export restrictions not only impact import from outside of the EU into the EU from countries like India, China, but also export from one member state to another or to other global markets who rely on medicines manufactured or transiting through Europe. So these were some of the hurdles that we identified through the process that we could raise with a view to collaborating, working together with a sort of EU solidarity to make sure that we continue the supply of medicines to patients in need. Again, whether COVID-19 related or not, because of course the usual oncology, all other disease categories required the necessary treatments. So perhaps I'll wrap up there and leave some time for questions. Nathalie, back to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Indeed, it's collaboration, I think, is collaboration, speed, and ingenuity, I think, is really the ingredients that we are all facing and having to tackle right now. So for those of you on the line, thank you again for joining. We've just had a short presentation from each of our speakers, and now I'll be trying to pose a few questions to get this interactive part going for the next half hour. So maybe starting again at the origin, Paul, so in the research for treatment, vaccines, and diagnostics, you mentioned the objective of scaling up your manufacturing in order to be ready when and if a vaccine is found to be successful. What other measures are you taking to make sure that there's enough vaccine for everyone who needs it, should it prove to be effective?
Well, the most important one is speed to results. So that means that if you want to have many vaccines fast, we have to start now. And so we have started with the planning of upscaling, even where we didn't vaccinate yet the first human with the vaccine. And so we have a good insight in what we have to do. We have done all the different evaluations on the upscaling, made the selection of the vaccine, for maximal upscaling. And with the Persa 6 line, we have been able to get up to the 300 million and more per 2,000 liters per year. So if we have many plants, we can start in parallel with many plants producing, and that then will bring on board tens of millions of vaccines per month. What is going to be very important for all of the vaccines is a strategy of who to vaccinate in the world. First, starting with the high-risk populations. That's not up to the industry to determine that, but it's a logic medical approach, is that first all the healthcare workers in the entire world would be vaccinated as they are confronted every day with the disease. And then, of course, higher risk people, which are the elderly, immunodepressed people, people with certain disease states, so that gradually we can very quickly reduce mortality in the high risk people, so that then later on the larger quantities of people could be vaccinated to prevent the disease. So a combination of increasing production fast with strategies on how to deploy the vaccine, I think is going to be needed. But of course there are limitations to manufacturing. Just the number of vials, the number of needles, the number of it is not just never done before to go to a multi-billion vaccines in such a short time frame. But the technology is there, the capacity is there, and finding partners to do this will help to make it work.
Thank you very much, Paul. And indeed, partners, I believe there are around 45 research centers. We have a question coming in from a journalist that there are 45 research centers working on developing COVID vaccine. And there's a question on how is industry managing the collaboration and the patenting of a finally or more than one finally selected vaccine. It's early days, I know, already in this for this kind of a conversation, but people are wondering how we will go forward. I don't know if you already have some strategies in mind, Paul, that you'd like to share.
Well, there are different technologies being used, and other people can chime in here. There are different technologies being used. We use a vector-based vaccine. Other companies use protein-based vaccines. Then there is also the mRNA and the DNA vaccines. Each of them are different technologies. And it's important that different technologies are evaluated, because we don't know yet which one will give the best immunity and therefore it's going to be important that first of all, several are equated to de-risk the fact that we will not have a vaccine, and then that within those categories, I think people have to make the choice on which one is the most likely to succeed. We never will be able to develop 40 or 50 vaccines in parallel. The industry, the large industry partners probably have each to choose one or two to focus on, and then put them in their global machinery to see whether we can get them developed and get them upscaled. But it's an unprecedented effort which needs to happen here.
Thank you very much, Paul. And then if I could quickly, Alan, you know, we're all focusing on COVID, as you said, but it's not just COVID, and there are other things happening. You mentioned the 4 roads to the 4 points of the road to innovation that EFPIA had been developing even before. So people are still thinking about innovating and pushing forward with longer term initiatives, not just the ones based on COVID, perhaps learning indeed from what is happening in COVID and seeing how much it applies. How do you see that in the industry at the moment as the chair of the Regulatory Strategy Committee within EFPIA?
Yeah, certainly. In the last month or two, the focus on the Regulatory Strategy Committee has been really and working with other groups in EFPIA to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. Having said that, I hope I got across the points that I think the things that have been working on in the long term, like these 4 pillars of the regulatory road to innovation, are equally applicable to innovative therapies and other therapeutic areas. And I think that's important that we take the learnings from COVID and apply those, working with regulators across the world, able to develop better practices for the future. I don't think we can go back after this. We have to learn from some of these areas. And in fact, I think COVID can maybe even, products can learn from some of the development from other learnings from other therapeutic areas, particularly oncology. I saw a quote from Scott Gottlieb a couple of weeks ago to that effect, particularly around some of the work FDA has done on oncology therapeutics. So I think there definitely are some learnings that we can take from the past, also from previous pandemics, and but also perhaps bring some of the learnings that we've had in developing innovative products to deal with other therapeutic areas to the fore as well.
And actually touching upon that, we have a question from Peggy Maguire, European Institute of Women's Health. She was pointing to the fact that, of course, the COVID-19 virus is complex and dangerous for vulnerable groups like those suffering from chronic conditions, older people, pregnant women, and was asking how do we manage or envisage our clinical trials with these groups taking place at the moment.
Yeah, I think Paul actually dealt with that also to some degree in his earlier comments. It was interesting, actually, here in the UK, I noticed this question actually was raised at the government response over a weekend, and I think there are definitely, in addition to the elderly, in addition to the patients with pre-existing comorbidities, there are some growing bodies of evidence that certain patient groups like the BAME population may have additional vulnerabilities. I don't think the reasons for that have been fully elucidated yet. It could be because of the types of jobs that they're doing. You know, they could be more healthcare workers. They could have more people working in transport, etc. But I think that's been recognised, and I know the UK government, for example, are collecting more data on that. I think as well, the other thing I would add is I guess that vaccines trials historically have tried to identify and vaccination programs have tried to identify the highest risk patients, and therefore one would hope in the development of these COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics that high risk patients would almost automatically be enrolled. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Yeah, let me comment to that. It's absolutely necessary that the elderly are as quickly as possible included, as they are the highest risk people. Like in RSV vaccines, RSV is also let's say a very important pathogen for elderly. It's important the clinical trials immediately go into those populations to have the answer as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm trying to consolidate all the different questions coming from everywhere. Simon, I have a question here from Political to you on how well have industry collaborated with each other to guarantee the supply of medicines, and what could the EU do to help more?
I think through the single point of contact process with the European Medicines Agency and heads of medicines agencies of member states, we were able to coordinate and work together on continuing supply and to have a sort of forward-looking process through the collaboration I mentioned with the generics group on transparency of availability of medicines in the coming month, 2 months, based on predictions on epidemiological modeling. Once that becomes more fine-tuned and available from the European Center for Disease Control, which is probably something, looking forward, something we could hope to activate more quickly once we know what the treatment, the clinical protocol is at hospital level, identify that rapidly, communicate back to industry so that we can then do the necessary forecasting for production. But I think I answered the question there, that basically that process of transparency has been put in place and is operating.
Thank you very much, Simon. So we had questions that we received before, questions that I'm receiving now, so it's quite an interesting test of my flexibility of looking at different screens. There was a question also, maybe I can just stay with you, Simon, for 1 second. What would you say the challenges currently faced by EFPIA members in terms of shortages occasioned by COVID-19 are, if you had to summarize? If that's even possible.
I think the key issues are when, as a result of the pandemic and confinement and border restrictions and so on, additional hurdles have been imposed on what is already a quite complex supply chain process. I mean, in normal times, let's say, it's complex, but it's highly orchestrated and finely tuned to function well and meet the needs of getting medicines to patients. When new hurdles are imposed, like border restrictions, potential requisitioning, the need to prove the types of product that you're moving in and out of a country, when this is information that's already known and available. Adding additional hurdles, administrative, bureaucratic hurdles, I think from what I've seen has been sort of one of the main logistical, operational issues that have come in the way of free-flowing supply.
Thank you very much. Paul, I have a question here again from a journalist from the research perspective. Do you think that companies have sufficient access to data and samples from COVID-19 patients?
Yeah, currently, yes. I think there is a whole academic network in the world and clinical network who has access to samples and is using them to sequence them and continuously follow whether the virus is changing or whether it stays on track. So also whether it stays quite similar. So I think that's not a problem. It's not that easy to grow the virus. So in laboratory strains in animals for clinical trials, so people have had access to the virus. Let me give one other comment, which I saw on the question was on taking risk with the speed and whether we knew something about this. We have been doing already SARS research 15 years ago, and from that we had already good insights in R&D, which helped us to understand SARS and this virus. Although they are completely different viruses, there's a lot of homology where we learned from that, a lot of overlapping things in the spike, for example, which were similar. And so that gave us an early insight on what to do. And then the second question I saw was on missing steps. No, we don't do that. We do all the work in parallel at the moment. But what the regulatory authorities allow is to use information from other clinical trials with similar vectors, similar pathways, similar experience, and they can use that information to get better insights in safety. So why can we go fast? Because it's of course it's a very very well documented pathway which we can use here to get fast to a vaccine, as well as doing massive research in parallel, both in animals and in humans. So just a few questions at the same time. I try to help you forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Alan, I'm not going to let you off the hook so easily. So I'm just going to come to you. Do you, I mean, of course, everything is being, flexibility, you mentioned regulatory flexibility is extremely important. Speed is important. And while we streamline the regulatory procedures for assessing the evidence for any new treatment or vaccine for COVID-19, some people may ask themselves, will the faster pace lead to a lowering of standards for quality or safety or efficacy?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, very legitimate question. And I did try to deal with it rather proactively in my presentation, but maybe I can kind of elaborate a little bit further. I think it would not behoove anyone to develop a vaccine or a therapeutic that was not considered or was not safe, efficacious, or was of low quality. And I think the issue we're faced with here is to bring these products to market quickly, but to ensure that they have they meet the current regulatory standards and they have a positive risk benefit. Now, having said that, I think there are a whole number of things that we can do within both the existing regulatory framework, but would also, if we were to think a little bit more out the box. So we know from the Ebola experience, we know from the previous H1N1 pandemic that there are regulatory flexibilities that can be extended to products and vaccines that are addressing these pandemics. I think these can be very simple regulatory mechanisms on a European level within the framework. So, for example, to have a reduced commission decision phase. I think in the H1N1 it was reduced to 2 days. You could have a rolling review of data. There are, which I mentioned in the dynamic assessment. You could have simplified safety reporting and PSUR submission. So I think there are a whole suite of tools we can use in a European context for products that address serious unmet medical needs or pandemics. And I'm sure there are more flexibilities that could be considered with labeling, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one approach. I think the second approach, and one that would require more discussion clearly, is around the reliance model and reliance modeling. Now, clearly, once a trial comes up with a vaccine or a therapeutic that has a positive risk benefit, there is going to be an enormous pressure on making that product available, and perhaps initially those products or that product can be made available under compassionate use programs, but we clearly will need a robust regulatory mechanism to deal with that. And I think this is something that regulators and sponsors will have to discuss on how we do that on a global basis. And perhaps here in Europe, there is an opportunity for the European Medicines Agency, as the chair of the ICMA group, to be able to facilitate a more collaborative model between regulators, including perhaps some sort of reliance model. I don't think these discussions have been fully thought through yet, but that could be one possible route for the future.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I've received a combination of 2 questions around flu and anti-pneumococcal vaccination. So the first question, and I think this is both to Paul and Simon, I'm going to put the 2 questions together and then maybe you can answer together, is have we received a higher request on flu and anti-pneumococcal vaccine for the 2020 seasonal vaccination campaign planned in the autumn, and how are we imagining our role in this context to avoid any shortages risk on the back of COVID. Paul and then Simon, yeah.
I can't answer that. I don't have insight, or at least I didn't look for that, whether there was less or more request for it.
Thank you, Paul.
I hope people continue to vaccinate as normal, because it's very important for their health. And
yeah, I can add to confirm, yes, we have seen an increase in pneumococcal vaccine demand, respiratory vaccines in general, increased demand, and no indication that we can't manufacture to meet that demand. So, yep.
Very good. Thank you very much, Simon. There are quite a few questions as well regarding the industrial strategy for Europe that has been under discussion quite a lot, and the concerns about our supply chains being global. There's a specific question here: do we need a new European industrial policy to make Europe's industry more resilient to such events and avoid disruptions in global value and production chains by supporting the reintegration of chains inside the EU? Could this mean an increased European production of medicines?
Yeah, I could take that one as well, Nathalie. It's a good question. I think, as I indicated, with border restrictions, export restrictions, even within the EU, I'm not sure this proposal would, solve everything. We'd still have those hurdles to overcome. But generally speaking, and I think this probably goes beyond the pharmaceutical industry, but supply chains in general, whether it's food, other sectors of industry. To me, as a biologist, I think our supply chains should be respecting environmental health. I mean, our well-being depends on the well-being of the environment. I think whatever we can do to improve in that area is necessary, and as a almost a side effect, that would benefit by having more regional, local, short supply routes. So yes, probably.
Thank you very much. Paul, going back to you, there's a question here on research. To what extent your work related to the development of new treatments and vaccines against COVID-19 is publicly funded, and how would you make that information available? This is a topic that comes up often to do with innovative methods, and here particularly in the context of COVID-19.
No, it's a very good question, and a very important topic that in this circumstance, if we talk about this pandemic, which is the worst one, this is the worst health crisis in probably 100 years for humanity, that we all work together. And so there is an agreement that all information, as soon as available in research, also in clinical and in all aspects of it, is shared, even on publications online. But also fora like at the WHO, there has been scientific fora where the science for the vaccines has been shared, the new animal models, everything which we can get faster shared will lead to a more important result. And in this circumstance, it's not for industry, nor for academia, nor for research institutions, whether it's us versus them. It's all together we have to do this, because we need to get society back on track. The economic impact of this is so huge that there is no time for not sharing. The time is there to share as much as we can. Whether we solve it or other partners solve it, it does not matter. Let's make sure we get it shared, and that's where we get it solved, and that's where sharing our information is very, very critical to inform each other on the learnings. Nobody should make a mistake. If we learn something, nobody should repeat that experiment if it didn't work out. So that is the way we agree to work.
Thank you very much, Paul. Indeed, I have another question for you. In the FT recently, Sanofi asked for an equivalent of the US government's BARDA in Europe, a Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. Do you share this opinion that we're missing something like that?
Yeah, we missed something. Well, we missed something. There's a lot of public funding on both all over the world, but there was little public funding which that urgently provided to players. And BARDA has been an organization which exists since a longer time for the biological preparedness since 9/11. People were thinking about what viruses or what are the biological agents who could threat the world. And BARDA was set up specifically to study global health security. And so people were focusing, and we are part of that research. We're thinking that influenza would be the next influenza would do what Corona is doing now, put the world to a stop. And so BARDA issued a lot of grants for small and larger companies to work on the influenza. But Europe we don't have that type of agency. Some of that was covered by IMI, like in Ebola, IMI did a lot of work. And so there were some grants, but nothing is organized that fast as BARDA. You know? Yeah. Also for us, within let's say 8 weeks from the start of when we had the virus for COVID-19, within 8 weeks we got going, and we got to a very large grant with BARDA. We jointly invest now with BARDA $1 billion, each do 50% of that. That's at the moment, there is no mechanism yet in Europe to do it that fast. But let me reassure you, the European Commission is absolutely on top of this now, with other partners of the G20, but also with other foundations, etc., to move very quickly to a funding capability which will help to accelerate vaccines and also drugs and diagnostics. So it will follow. But it needs some more organization if you do this with 50 countries instead of with one country.
Exactly. That's something we often forget, that the US is one country and we're at least 27 indeed. Yes. Alan, I had a question regarding clinical trials and the evidence that one of the people online sees regarding severity of symptoms for people living with obesity and other ethnic minorities. Will a special effort be made to ensure that these vulnerable groups are properly targeted to participate in therapy trials? And how would that happen?
Yeah, I think I answered that question earlier on, like with the comments I made around the other existing people with existing comorbidities, the BAME community, and I think Paul addressed it also in the with the point that trials must be designed to be able to recruit the most vulnerable patients. So I think it's exactly the same situation. Thank you.
We're getting close to 3:30, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to give each of our speakers 1 minute, which is never going to be long enough, to share with us perhaps the lesson, that the most important lesson that they have learned in this crisis that they believe can be applied to the future. And maybe it's not the faraway future, maybe it's to do with the products that we're developing today, or another crisis that we might face tomorrow, maybe both. Paul, can I start with you? You're on mute. You're on mute, Paul? Yeah.
We all knew that one day this was going to come. And I've been at many fora in the last 5, 6, 7 years post-Ebola, where we said we have to be better prepared. Nobody thought that it could go so fast, so extensive, and so radical in the world. And I think it's a big wake-up call. We all are prepared, every country is prepared to fight wars, to prevent economic downturn, to protect their assets, but nobody is prepared to fight a war for a virus. And now it looks like those can take us down. We thought the climate could take us down, maybe, yes, that will come, but that will come slowly. A virus took us down in 6 weeks. Yeah? So we have a common enemy, and there are many, many viruses like this around the world. We need to get diagnostic frameworks in place to make sure we can pick up this very early. We need to have measures to contain it very early and never take any risk anymore on that. And we need all tools to either treat or to vaccinate much faster than we can do today. And it will be a new world afterwards in science and development to make sure these tools will be available up front. There's nothing more important for the world than prevent this. The damage this is going to do to the world is incredible. So let's work on it. Science and technology will be able to solve this. So let's have a good part of our activities focused on that. Thank you.
Indeed. And Alan, from the regulatory side, what have we learned? What's the one important lesson that we need to learn and we need to apply for the near and further future?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things, Nathalie. Just to summarize things, I mean, clearly the pandemic is testing us all in our industry in particular. You know, because we are working on, if I look at what Simon's presented and what Paul's presented, you know, we're working with both research of new therapeutics, diagnostics and vaccines, but also trying to ensure that patients worldwide receive existing medicinal products, which now have, if you look at some old drugs like in neuromuscular blocking agents that are used to facilitate tracheal intubation, you know, the demand for those drugs and other ICU drugs has just gone through the roof. So I think managing through the short term has been, you know, a real test of our business continuity programs. But I think what I've seen is that the ability to shape policy and to work with regulators and healthcare authorities on a daily basis to change things is just unprecedented. And then finally, I think it's the point I tried to make earlier in the presentation, is that I am optimistic in that, in addition to this unprecedented collaboration helping us to evolve new vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19, that it will also ultimately advance the regulatory framework to create a regulatory toolbox, if you like, that will support innovative products in other areas in the future. So I think that's the upside I would see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And Simon, your learnings?
Yeah, I think sort of probably building on what both Paul and Alan have said, perhaps saying things in a slightly different way. I think, you know, a rapid identification of the specific pathology which is going to, you know, trigger a necessity for specific categories of medicines, identification of that early and putting in place a sort of rapid response team across industry, you know, of the relevant associations. So, you know, in this case, we're talking of protective equipment as well as medical devices and medicines. But, you know, next time round, it might be a mosquito-borne protozoan, which requires, you know, different categories of drug treatments. So identify that quickly, put a rapid response team in place, working with EMA and the Commission, partly to ensure that member states in the EU in particular, you know, operate with solidarity and collaboration. Because, you know, Europe is often the plaque tournante, the sort of center point of the global medicines distribution process for many companies. And so anything that happens in Europe can also impact, you know, populations beyond Europe. So we need to be vigilant about that and work together cooperatively. And just to add to what Alan said, I think a regulatory package of flexibility needs to be sort of there in the back pocket, ready to be implemented to, you know, ease the process of making medicines available to patients, which after all is what we're all here for.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Simon. I think there's lots of things that we can learn from this. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be doing more online seminars to go into a little bit more depth into what we've discussed this afternoon. Today's seminar is recorded, so we'll be making that available as well. We started with more than 125 participants. We still have more than 125 participants, so congratulations and thank you to our speakers for securing that. We haven't managed to answer all the questions. We're aware of that. Please contact us at EFPIA. You know where to find us if you feel your question hasn't been answered and you need an urgent answer. Otherwise, connect to our future seminars and we will do our best. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to our speakers and stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.